Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Hartglass. You are listening to It's All About Food. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about today's program. I want to introduce my guest, Jonathan Safran Foer. He is the author of novels Everything is Illuminated, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, and Here I Am, and of the nonfiction book, Eating Animals. His work has received numerous awards and has been translated into 36 languages. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. We are going to be talking today about his newest book, We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Did you have breakfast?
I sort of picked at things. In fact, it's a school day, so I was making breakfast for my kids, and oftentimes I will, have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. The truth is I'm not a huge breakfast person. I'm more of a
interesting.
Coffee person.
I agree. Saving the planet begins at breakfast. And we've heard over the decades that breakfast is the most important meal, but I think we're learning that that may or may not be the case. It really depends on who you are and how late you ate the day before.
Yes, one thing that we can say about nutritional information is that it seems to change with time, and also it seems to be highly particular to the person.
Exactly. I'm really glad you wrote this book, and I'd like to dig into it a little bit.
Sounds great.
What I love about it is you're a wonderful writer and a great storyteller, and you make it engaging and easy to read about a very difficult subject.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I agree with the second part of what you said, which you said it's a very difficult subject. The subject being climate change. And it's a subject that I think it's very safe to say everybody listening to this knows about. There's virtually nobody in our country anymore who denies the science of climate change. And I think it's also quite safe to say that everybody listening to this cares about it. The problem is it's hard to care about it over time. It's easy to care about it when looking at images of a superstorm approaching a coast, or looking at images of flooding or a drought, or reading an article about the ice sheets melting or climate refugees. But it's also very, very easy to forget about it when not looking at those things. I have found it very hard to carry my concern around with me and to incorporate it into my daily life and daily choices, because climate change has a quality of feeling, whatever it is that we know and whatever it is that we care, it has a quality of feeling kind of far away and a bit abstract, like it's happening somewhere else.
You mentioned you describe it as over there.
Yeah. And both the problem and the solution. We think of what's happening in terms of the effect as being over there in Bangladesh or over there in the future. And we think of the solution as being somewhere over there, like if only those corporations would change their policies, if only those governments would change their policies. And the challenge, and by the way, it's true that we absolutely need corporations and governments to change. But there's a role that we can play as well, both in terms of the real-world effects of our choices and also how the choices that we make as individuals affect corporations and governments.
I totally get that concept that it's not in my face right now, and I've got plenty of other things to think about. But do you think we're in a new era, or is this just something that's plagued humanity? You wrote, "We don't care, we don't believe, we don't commit." Is this something in the new millennium? Did we care more before?
I don't know. I am not as young as I used to be, but I am, still a product of this cultural moment. I grew up with the internet and the fracturing of messages and the diminishment of attentiveness, concentration and focus, and the kind of scattering of attention. So, I don't know if we would have addressed this problem differently at a different point. there are also things about this moment that make us, I think, more likely to properly grapple with it. Like it's probably easier to create movements now than it was in the past because information and voices can disseminate, more quickly and more powerfully than ever before. There are a lot of ways to explain how we got here and to sort of excuse how we got here. One statistic I find sort of remarkable is the amount of animal products that we eat right now in 2019 is the equivalent of every citizen of the world in the year 1700 eating 950 pounds of meat and drinking 1,200 gallons of milk every day. So, some of that is because we have this radically increased appetite for or access to animal products. A huge part of that is because of the population explosion. But in a way, it doesn't matter. What matters is here's where we are, And I think the way to address climate change and probably the way to address, political problems as well is instead of, parsing the process that brought us here and laying blame and finding justifications, instead to say, okay, this is where we are. Like, this is the reality. We live in a world of 7.5 billion people. We have a globe that doesn't seem to be getting any bigger. We have resources of limited quantities. Like, what are we going to do with it? What's the way forward?
I look at life that way, where you accept the parameters you're given and then move forward and act. That can happen if you're in a crisis mode with a disease, for example. Like, I have cancer. Now what am I going to do? And then you either do something about it or you don't. And this is just a giant cancer on the planet right now. And we all need to accept it and do big things about it.
Well, I think that's right. One distinction I would make with what you said, which may sound like no difference at all, but I really think is all the difference. You said we need to accept it. So it's worth exploring what's meant by accept it. There's a kind of misunderstanding that about half of our country doesn't accept it on the level of science, and it's not true. 91% of Americans accept the science of climate change. The problem is only 17% of Americans say they're alarmed by it. So it's very weird. How is it that 91% of us can know that the Earth is warming because of our actions, because of human actions, in a way that will have potentially catastrophic consequences? How can so many of us know that, but so few of us be alarmed by it? And I think the real disconnect isn't one having to do with knowledge. It has to do with a kind of belief in the knowledge, a belief in the implications of the knowledge, and that those implications demand something immediately of us.
Yes. So my question is, why did you write this book, and who did you write it for?
Gosh, I'm not sure I have answers to either of those questions. Why did I write it? I wrote it, I suppose, because there's an old saying, a joke. Once upon a time, there was a person whose life was so good, there's no story to tell about it. Stories seem to arise from conflict, a problem, something being not right, even a discomfort. And I'd had an increasing discomfort over the last couple of years about my relationship to climate change. Hearing myself say over and over and over so many times, someone has to do something, someone has to do something. Sometimes anger, sometimes with despair, sometimes with hope, sometimes with frustration. But for whatever reason, I wasn't included in the someone. If I were to really look at myself with a cold eye, I would have to acknowledge that, my carbon footprint was probably way worse than the average climate change denier. And saying that you acknowledge the science isn't going. It's not virtuous in and of itself, and it's definitely not going to save us. What will save us is action. And so I wanted to get serious about what actions are possible. And when I say possible, I mean both in the sense of what can I do, what can we do that will actually matter, because not everything matters the same, you know? Not using plastic straws or recycling matters, but not nearly as much as other things that we can do, like flying less or eating a plant-based diet. But I also wanted to find out what was possible in the sense of what my own limits are, because there are plenty of things that are good for the environment, like if I were to give up flying tomorrow, that I just can't do, you know? And maybe that should make me feel like a hypocrite. Maybe it should make me feel lazy. But I think it's a good starting point is to have an honest confrontation with what your own limits are. That can help, be the beginning of making a plan.
Well, you have a wide audience, and I'm sure they love to read your books. And so this is probably one of the best things that you could do. Write a book that a lot of people are going to read. And hope that there's a wave effect, like you talk about in the book, where we each are called to action to do something significant. The book is written in 5 parts, and the first part, Unbelievable, you talk about a lot of different stories and make some great analogies. I feel like I'm hit over the head over and over and over and over. Yeah, okay, I get it. And then you lead us to some 63 pages later, what it is that you think we all should be doing, and that is eating less animals, maybe not even eating any animals, and eating more plants. And I thought it was a very interesting approach, and I enjoyed it. I've been a vegan for over 30 years, so for me, I knew where you were going. I'm curious about others who maybe don't know where you're going, how they feel when they get there. Do you have a feeling for that yet? I know the book hasn't been released yet, but you've been talking about it, and people have been reading it already.
Yeah. I can tell you how I felt, which is I've been an on and off vegetarian since I was a kid. But I felt, I should say I didn't want to write a book about food at all. I'd already done that. I wanted to write a book about climate change. And when I realized the uncontroversial, unambiguous role of food in climate change, that it's either the most important choice one makes in one's daily life or the second most, I felt like, this is a drag. I felt like it's not. But, if we could solve climate change by not punching ourselves in the face, man, that would be great, and we would have solved it already. The problem is, solving it requires us to do less, not to give up, and that's an important distinction, but to do a lot less of things that bring us pleasure. And that most people, you may not be one of those people, but most people think are really good things in their lives. So flying, it's terrible for the environment, and yet it is such a huge pleasure in my life, getting to see other parts of the world and encounter other physical landscapes, try other kinds of foods, meet other kinds of people. And I think it feels like an ethical good as well, having my very limited perspective widened, realizing that my way of doing things and my way of living is only one tiny sliver of the possible ways of moving through the world. But we cannot do as much of it as we've been doing if we want to protect the planet. It's like 1 + 1 = 2. And it's the same with food. Most people, most of your listeners, I assume, have been eating meat their whole lives, and they think it smells good, they think it tastes good, and they probably have many positive and beautiful associations with it and memories that meat evokes. Meals parents and grandparents prepared, meals with friends. So it's hard. It's hard to give that up. But again, this is our situation. You know, I doubt anybody listening right now wants to think of him or herself as a science denier. You know, this is what the science tells us. This is not my opinion. It's not my perspective. The IPCC, which has become, kind of the gold standard for climate science, in their last report said, even if we were to do everything else that we're talking about with fossil fuels, we have no hope of meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Accord if we don't radically reduce the amount of animal products that we eat. And we actually know what that amount is that has to be reduced. The most comprehensive analysis of the relationship between animal agriculture and climate change, which studied food systems all across the globe, and this was published at the end of 2018, the authors said that while people who live in malnourished parts of the world without access to other kinds of foods could actually eat a little bit more meat and dairy, people who live in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe have to reduce their meat consumption by 90% and their dairy by 60%. So most people, when they hear that, will say, that sucks. That just sucks. And to those people, I would say, yeah, like that's a legit first reaction to that, if this is something you've been used to your whole life. But there are other ways of looking at it, too. Like, we can do this. There's plenty of other kinds of things that we can eat. In fact, every day there seem to be more other things we can eat. We're not talking about, reversing your personal identity or making a binary flip of a switch. It's a process that can take time, and it's about reduction. It's not some sort of, we don't need to invent an entirely new way of farming or an entirely new way of eating. We kind of just need to uninvent what's happened over the last 50 years, which is the advent of factory farming, which is now responsible for 99.9% of the animals that are eaten in the United States, and eating habits that just aren't what they used to be. 1/3 of Americans eat in a fast food restaurant every single day. 1 out of 5 meals in America are eaten in a car. We eat vastly more meat than we used to. Our grandparents, great-grandparents would have a much more diverse plate of food in front of them, with grains or beans and vegetables, and meat was something more like a garnish or like a special treat, like a once-a-week special meal. And now there's the expectation of having like a big brick of animal protein at the center of a plate that's maybe surrounded by a couple of things. So we need to find ways to be a little more conservative with our eating. This isn't a radical. It's not a call to eat radically. It's a call to eat a little bit more conservatively.
I find it funny that you said you didn't start out to write a book about food. You wanted to write a book about climate change, and look what you end up recommending, something about food.
Well, let me say, and this is really important, and I can't say this enough, it's not my recommendation. Like, this is not my recommendation. This is just the science.
Yes.
And with this kind of, with climate change and with food, with everything having to do with climate change, it's really tempting to look at it as somebody's opinion or recommendation, and we have to keep reminding ourselves, this is nobody's opinion or anything. This is just the science. The science is totally uncontroversial and totally unambiguous. We know exactly what we have to do. We know that climate change is happening. We know the rate at which it's happening, approximately. We know what is likely to have different likely outcomes. We know that there are 4 activities that matter more than all others, dramatically more than all others, which are flying less, living carb-free, which is significantly better than having a hybrid, controlling overpopulation, and eating a plant-based diet, moving away from animal products as much as possible. I've yet to meet a climate scientist who would disagree with that statement. This is just accepted science.
I agree with you about the science, and I have a science background, and I've read a lot of science reports over the last few decades about climate change, and some of it has been so frightening. And a lot of it's very difficult to read. And I think it comes back to what you say about how we don't believe. I think it's very hard to believe because a lot of people may read a simple summary of some science report, but it's still very hard to comprehend and believe. I also liked how you said we need to uninvent what we've done in the last 50 years. And it's amazing how we have really changed our culture so quickly in this short amount of time to get to where we are today. It seems rather easily. It's been done really easily, but to go backwards is going to be rather challenging. And part of the problem, I recently read another book which hasn't been released yet called The Meat Question. And in that book, one of the questions was, does affluence encourage people to eat more meat? And the author was saying that that's not the only thing. It's the government regulations and the subsidies to support growing meat and making it, quote, affordable for people, and then having food deserts or places where people don't have access to anything else but fast food, and so they end up eating meat, and that in some ways it's not a choice for many people. It's just what's there.
Well, that's absolutely right. And that's something we have to not only be sensitive to when talking about how we're going to change in response to the climate. It's simply a problem that we need to solve. Too often what happens is people will point at the existence of food deserts as a reason why they shouldn't make any dietary changes in their own lives, despite having all the access in the world. What I would prefer to say is we cannot live in a country or a world where there are people in food deserts. It should be an absolute right to have access to fresh food and healthy food, and we need to work on that problem while we work on these other problems, rather than simply point to them as a justification for not changing. But I think that some of the understandings of meat reduction are really wrong on a factual basis. Harvard Medical School did a study in 2018 and found that a healthy vegetarian diet is $750 a year cheaper than a healthy meat diet. And more than that, a healthy vegetarian diet is $250 a year cheaper than an unhealthy meat diet. But it's cheaper to eat as a healthy vegetarian than to eat fast food. People who make less than $30,000 a year are 2.5 times more likely to be vegetarian than people who make more than $75,000 a year. And people of color are disproportionately vegetarian. So, I have heard many times, and I'm sure you've heard many times, that this is like an elitist argument that we should eat differently.
Absolutely.
It's just the opposite. It's just the opposite. It's less expensive. It's better for the planet. It's better for our bodies. And it's, I've yet to ever hear anybody present to me an argument that we should be eating more animal products. When my book Eating Animals came out, I did a lot of radio shows and some TV shows, and I had this funny experience. It happened, a dozen times. When the night before the show, the producer would call me and say, "Hey, this is a little awkward, but do you know anybody who might sit across the table from you and present the other side?" I was like, "You're asking me for that?" And they said, "Yeah, we can't. And it's for two reasons. One, because the only argument for eating more animal products is that they taste good. That's it. There's no argument from health. There's no argument environmentally. There's no argument in terms of cost. There's simply no argument. And secondly, the meat industry knows this and also knows that the more people think and talk about this, the less likely they are to eat meat. So the more access you have to what goes on in farms, and I'm talking about factory farms now, which is quite different than small and family farms, and if we have time we can get into that. I'm not vilifying farmers. That's not what I'm into. Every farmer I've ever met I've liked, and I think that they're honest people who I frankly have a great deal of respect for. Nobody ever became a farmer to be cruel to animals or to be destructive to the environment. I'm talking about the industry that's now responsible for 99.9% of the meat that we eat in America, which farmers despise. They hate it. The Democratic presidential hopefuls are in Iowa and New Hampshire right now, basically just pandering for votes, saying whatever it is will get people to like them. It's really interesting. In Iowa, the way that they pander in the farming capital of the world is to suggest anti-factory farming regulation, because that's what farmers want to hear. Because they, despise this industry that we have.
Well, doing away with industrial farming, factory farming, confined animal feedlots, all of those things need to go, and it would definitely help in terms of our climate and so much more. So,
and by the way, so yeah. With all industrial food production. I mean, there is an important, sometimes people say, yeah, but, sausage is starting to whatever kind of vegetable and ship it halfway around the world. Those people are right. They're absolutely right. We need to find better ways of growing everything. It just so happens that meat is vastly worse than all of the other kinds of foods that we're talking about. And if we could first make a shift away from animal agriculture toward other kinds of foods, we also, hand in hand, have to be moving toward better, methods of production for foods that aren't meat.
We need to redefine convenience and efficiency, because there are lots of parts of convenience and efficiency that really aren't convenient or efficient and ends up killing us.
Right.
In the second part of the book, How to Prevent the Greatest Dying, you chose a different style. We had all of the bullet points of different items that you wanted to talk about. Why did you choose that approach? It kind of reminded me of a lot of different pamphlets that I've seen over the years that highlight the different facts.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to correct a misunderstanding about climate change, which is that fossil fuels are the only thing that matter. We really directed all of our attention at fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are deserving of enormous attention and an enormous problem, but there's an equal culprit, which is animal agriculture. And so I was trying to make a case for why we need to think about that as well. But I wanted to make it as efficiently as possible and with some, understanding, I guess, of at least my own psychology, which is one doesn't need a comprehensive scientific argument. One needs a scientific argument that is compelling, is motivating, not only motivating to share at a dinner party, but motivating to inspire you to maybe eat something different at that dinner party. So, as I was saying earlier, information isn't really the problem right now, in the sense that we're not battling against ignorance, although there are certain kind of information that we could stand to pay more attention to, like what are the most important things that we can do, what's the hierarchy of importance, so that we don't, accidentally over-invest ourselves in things that aren't as significant. But the real problem is how to take information and present it in a way that it has an effect, an effect greater than just making a reader say, that's interesting, or, ooh, that's alarming. Or even like, hey, brother, you're never going to believe what I just read. You got to hear this. What we need is information that is part of solving the problem. So I tried to be not only concise, but to choose facts that would have a kind of, I write about in the book this experience that a lot of astronauts have had when they go to space and see Earth for the first time as a globe. It has very consistently moved astronauts really deeply and changed them. Many of them, the great majority of them, have come back and talked about that experience of seeing the Earth and sort of recognizing, oddly, for the first time, that we live on a planet and that the planet is deserving of protection and that the planet is fragile. And this phenomenon has been given a name, which is the overview effect. It's like a sudden jolt of perspective. And I did my best to find facts that created, very tiny versions of that. You could read it and say, I see now. Yes, that's like, I hadn't understood it in quite that way before.
I loved reading about that. I didn't know about it, and I wish that there was a way where we could all realize that Earth is fragile and our home, and just kind of out there in the cold, dark universe.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated reading about that, and I hope that other people get that same feeling, because it really did move me. And you talk about that in the third section, only home. And you also talk about what the United States government has done with the environment and fighting the greenhouse effect. And we had a few decades ago, under George H.W. Bush, and the Republicans at that time supported protecting the environment, certainly a lot more than they seem to want to today. And I'm not quite sure how that has happened and how we're going to undo all of that, but we definitely need both parties supporting our little home, planet Earth.
Yeah, I think that it's easy to it's easy to sort of like overstate how much things have changed. If Hillary had been president, then we would still be
yes, if only, yeah.
We would still be in the Paris Climate Accords, but we would not have met its goals. We would not have even approached its goals, and no country in Europe is going to meet its goals. So, what did it mean that Trump pulled us out? It was certainly a horrible symbolic act, and he has deregulated in ways that have real-world consequences. There's maybe another way of looking at it, which is that he may be the most important environmentalist in the world right now, in the sense that his ignorance, I was saying before only 9% of Americans deny climate change. He's in that 9%. His ignorance is kind of forcing on us as a country a different kind of wisdom, and his inaction is forcing a kind of action on us. Mm-hmm. The environmental movement is so much stronger now than it was 2 years ago. Yeah. The level of awareness and consciousness is so much greater. It may be that he brought us to a place that felt so scary and dark that it finally required or inspired a response. So we cannot solve this alone as individuals. Earlier I said the four most important things that one can do, are fly less, drive less, eat less meat, and control overpopulation. There's actually one thing that matters more than even all four of those, which is to vote. That is the most important act that one can take make vis-a-vis the environment. And unfortunately, there have been studies that have shown out that a lot of environmentalists didn't vote in the last election. Wow. A lot of people who even said they voted didn't actually vote. The numbers just weren't lining up at all. So, anybody out there who cares, which is to say everybody, I think that it is absolutely essential that we make changes in our own lives, which have these real-world effects, and also push, corporations to make different kinds of products, and push governments to legislate in ways that will make it easier for us to make good decisions. But we also have to vote and be as politically active as possible.
You did bring up World War II and the analogy about how we all worked together. We were all one in supporting the war, and the government was a part of that, a big part of that. And we need that again, where we're all in this together. to save our home, and we're not.
Yeah, we need to stop looking at this as like a political issue, because it really isn't one.
It is
And
not one.
we need to stop like scoring. And by the way, liberals are very guilty of this. Like, I think of myself as a liberal, and liberals are guilty of demeaning conservatives and giving them reasons to feel that we think they're stupid or ignorant or don't care. Conservatives care about the planet every bit as much as liberals do. They love their kids and grandkids every bit as much as liberals do. But the optics of environmentalism have been hijacked by liberals, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons. And half of the country can't solve this problem. We're either going to solve it together or we're going to suffer it together. And there are different ways of talking that, instead of shining a light on our disagreements, which are sometimes large, but not nearly as large as our vast agreements, that we don't want air pollution, we don't want water pollution, we don't want uninhabitable cities, we don't want droughts, we don't want kids dying of climate-related illnesses.
We all want the same thing. We do.
Yeah, but we need to talk in a way that reflects that.
I like the way you ended the third part of what did you call the third part? Only home. If we can't clean up our water and air, we can always manage on a planet without any.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, we do so many crazy things to, quote, solve a problem where the answer is right in front of our nose, and it's not difficult at all, but somehow we make it very difficult. The fourth part of the book, Dispute with the Soul, I think is my very favorite. I want to ask you, how is your soul doing today now that you've written your book?
I'm not even sure I have one, but if I do, that section of the book was a kind of echo of, the book begins with a description of the oldest known suicide note, which was written in Egypt 4,000 years ago, and has been called or titled Dispute with the Soul of One Who is Tired of Life. And it's this really weird document where a person is arguing with his soul, seeking consent to kill himself. And it's, kind of weird argument for death that also looks an awful lot like an argument for life. And I was thinking about that throughout the course of writing the book, and I devoted a chapter to an argument like that with myself, which it didn't feel like a literary conceit. It didn't feel like something I was planning exactly. It was, it really was a record of an internal debate that I was having. And I found it very challenging and very embarrassing at times, to have to confront my own hypocrisies or my own limitations or my own conflicted ways of understanding these things. And I should say, that chapter ends, obviously, as all chapters end, but the debate hasn't ended. I still wrestle with these things virtually every day. Often when I'm making
this tool that you've used it in Eating Animals, and you've used it more so in We Are the Weather, exposing yourself and the questions that you have and how humbling it can be is, I think, a very genuine way to connect with the readers. And something that's unique in this kind of book, because I think I've read just about all of the why we need to eat less animals and more plants kind of books. And some are preachy, some are factual, very dry. And this is very genuine and human.
Well, I was trying to be honest.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You say in part 4, and this is my question, but it's also a question that came in from one of my listeners. You've set a deadline of, after finishing the book, you would give up dairy and eggs, and I'm wondering how you're doing with that.
So, just to be precise, what I had said was that I would do this diet that I was suggesting in the book, which was to give up dairy and eggs for breakfast and lunch. And then in the book, what I say is what we need to do collectively is not eat animal products for breakfast and lunch, and then for dinner, you eat whatever you're going to eat. In my case, I was already starting as a vegetarian, so so that is what I do now. I don't eat animal products for breakfast and lunch. For dinner, sometimes I do. I always eat as a vegetarian. Sometimes I do. Usually I don't. Certainly when I'm at home, I don't, because it's very easy. I find it very, very easy at home to simply not have animal products. I find when I travel, it's more difficult, particularly when I'm in like social situations when I travel. So, this is another case of like honesty. It would be easier to say to you, yeah, totally. Like I just do it all the time and no big deal. And even when it is a big deal, that's not going to get in my way. I'm just going to figure it out. But my truth is, this is like a process for me. It's not an event. I did change pretty dramatically since I wrote the book, or in the process of writing the book. I would say I have cut my dairy and egg consumption by, 80%. And then the times when I still have them are usually in situations where I don't know how to navigate. I haven't figured out yet how to navigate certain kinds of social situations. I assume it's something I'll get better at as time passes, but like a lot of this stuff, it actually takes some practice. It takes some learning. Sometimes that learning is learning how to cook differently or how to shop differently. Sometimes the learning is learning different eating habits. Like I'm going to sit at a table and devote real time to this meal instead of just doing it in passing. Sometimes it's social learning. Social learning, like learning how to say, I don't eat that in a way that feels okay. Because sometimes it just doesn't feel okay. Like if you're, a guest in someone's home and you know that they've spent hours preparing something and it was your fault for not having mentioned it in advance, and sometimes it doesn't feel okay. But as I've learned, there are ways of preventing that, like mentioning it in advance and mentioning it in a certain way, that doesn't make the other person the referent. It doesn't make the other person feel bad, but is more conversational. And so I'm figuring it out. But the short answer to your question is yes, I'm doing what I talk about in the book.
Very good. It's all about progress and not perfection. Yeah. I'm reminded of my friend John Robbins, who wrote Diet for New America back in 1987, more than 30 years ago. And at the time, he talked about climate change along with lots of other issues related to eating animals. And his basic recommendation is we all need to reduce 10% what we're eating. Reduce animal products by 10%. He wasn't asking for a lot in order to make profound change. I mean, I personally would like to see a world of vegans, but in order to make dramatic climate change, everybody just needs to eat a lot less. And if it's doing it for breakfast and lunch, I'm good with that. We just need to see the change. And this is a little off, but you did mention about one of your challenges is with cravings. And I'm just curious, do you know where those cravings come from, or why you get cravings for animal food sometimes? Is it just because you're hungry and you're in a place where you don't have choices?
No, I assume the cravings are it's like a habit, and it's kind of an addiction. I mean, some of it is, I think, probably just something innate in us. People have been eating these things for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it's not a coincidence, like it does taste good to almost everybody. We may be born with some degree of taste for it. That having been said, people lose their taste for it, and not everybody does have a taste for it. My kids are vegetarian and have no desire to eat meat at all. That said, they love a veggie burger. They love a Beyond Burger. So there's something still in that taste that is appealing to them It's just that they don't have the same kind of layered, emotional, I would say, addiction or whatever the right word is. That
addiction is a big part of it, absolutely, and it affects some people a lot more than others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's science for that. I also wanted to thank you for discussing the work by Robert Goodlin and Jeff Anhang. And also in your appendix, you gave a good discussion about how much impact animal agriculture has on climate change, because there's a lot of variability and discussion about how much, and those numbers are hard to get at. And some people just like to quote Goodlin and Anhang's World Watch article, 51% of animal agriculture is, or 51% of human-induced greenhouse gases caused by animal agriculture. We all love that number and love to use it. But it's a bigger picture, and it's a complicated picture, and I really appreciated you taking the time to talk about it, highlight them, and kind of give some clarity about it.
Yes, it's confusing, and
it's
I think
very confusing.
It's a mistake to pretend that we know more than we do, but it's a bigger mistake to pretend that we know less than we do. And whether the number is at the low end of the range or near the high end of the range, what we know is exactly what the IPCC said in their last report, which is we just can't solve this problem, the broad problem of climate change, without solving the problem of animal agriculture. So it's good to try to be as precise as possible, and it's good to be honest about the imprecision, but it's necessary in a way that it also can miss the point. Like, the really salient point is this is a huge problem that we have to solve.
There have been a number of articles coming out about your book, and I'm sure you're aware of Mark Bittman's article in the New York Times. I don't know if you read your press. There was an article, Meat is Murder, but you knew that already. And I'm sure that he appreciates this book. It's probably because his cookbook, Vegan Before 6, would make a great companion piece with yours. You're recommending people not eat meat, not eat animals for breakfast and lunch, and he's got the cookbook for you, Vegan Before 6. I was curious about how he ended his article, saying, but individual decisions are limited. Without effective, sane, forward-thinking leadership, the needed change won't happen. We Are the Weather is a why book. What we need are more how books. And I wondered what you thought about that. Personally, I think there are a gazillion how books out there. People just have to want to find them, but they're there.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a different moment than when he was doing his writing. We actually live in a slightly different world, where both in terms of like the will and in terms of how messages spread. He didn't really write in the age of social media. He didn't really write when the conversation felt the way that it does on college and high school campuses, for example. There's more vegetarians on American college campuses now than there are Catholics. This is not like a fringe thing. This is something that is cresting. And not to mention like the ascendancy of Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers. And what I would say even more importantly is a movement away from this binary of like vegetarian or not vegetarian, and toward people just wanting to eat less meat. 90% of the people who bought Beyond Burgers in supermarkets also buy meat in the same period of time that the study was conducted. So, if he's saying we need structural change to help us make these decisions, I completely agree. Like if, meat would only cost what it actually costs, then people would eat a lot less. But that's just not going to happen unless we push for it to happen. And the best way to push for it to happen is by withholding money from the meat industry and by demanding different kinds of products. So a great example is cage-free eggs, which are the fastest growing sector in the food industry. And those came about not because of legislation and not because of some sort of corporate enlightenment, but because a lot of people all over the place wanted them. And asked for them. And it changed both farming practices and now legislation around, the treatment of egg-laying hens is also in the works. So it's not a question of whether it's ground up or trickle down. It's got to be both, reinforcing each other.
Jonathan Safran Foer, I want to thank you for chatting with me today and for writing this book, We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast. I've really enjoyed reading it and speaking with you today. I know that it's a busy time for you. We're in the middle of the Rosh Hashanah holiday. I want to wish you a Lashana Tova.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I also want to mention I have a lot of vegan recipes for holidays, including Rosh Hashanah, vegan challahs, and honey cakes that aren't made with honey, if you ever need to have some of those.
That sounds good. That sounds great.
I got you covered there. So
Good.
Thank you again for joining me.
Thank you.
And best of luck with this book, and I hope you help save the planet.
No, we will all do it together, or we will all not do it together.
Exactly. We're in the same boat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Have a good one. That was Jonathan Safran Foer, everybody, the author of the new book, We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast. And I encourage you to pick that up and read it and share it, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, it's good reading, and it can help make a very profound difference. We just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to share a few things. I think the last program I had, or maybe another time before that, I mentioned a few programs that are going on, and I have another one to mention. You know that I'm a big fan of Dr. Joel Fuhrman, and he's my favorite doctor. So I'm very happy to share different programs that he's promoting. And if you want to learn more about the one I'm going to mention right now, just go to my website, responsibleeatingandliving.com. There's a link for it. He's having a guided detox, intermittent fasting. And it's a course that lasts most of November, and it's online. And there's a lot of wonderful things about it. You get discussions from Dr. Fuhrman. He gives you 21 days of menus with recipes. And you learn about intermittent fasting, which is a great way to heal and cleanse and rejuvenate. And it's the timing of it is kind of to get you ready for the holidays, when everybody tends to overindulge. But this can help change some of your habits, maybe lose a little weight, maybe resolve some emotional eating issues. And there's a lot of supplemental materials too. So if you're interested, go to responsibleeatingandliving.com and find out more about the guided detox, intermittent fasting with Dr. Fuhrman, my favorite doctor. I'm in California right now. You know that I live in New York, and we had to come out here for a funeral, unfortunately, this week. And I'm here with Gary, and we took a trip to San Francisco yesterday. It was an incredibly gorgeous day, blue skies, fresh, cool air. And we stopped at a little restaurant called the Vegan Picnic. Have you heard of that? If you're ever in San Francisco, this is a wonderful little place to stop in. I want to say it is like fast food, and it's comfort food. And there are wonderful sandwiches, and the service is really great. They let us sample lots of the different salads, macaroni salad and coleslaw, egg salad, all the traditional kind of picnic foods that you would get, only made vegan. And I think if you're with people who aren't vegan, you might want to bring them to this spot, because there's a lot of familiar foods and it's really fun. But one of the things I was introduced to was a new cheese company, a new vegan cheese company called the Uncreamery in San Francisco. You can find them at theuncreamery.com. And you can buy their products at a website called milkguys.com. That's MYLKGUYS.com, milkguys.com. We tried the classic brie, the truffle brie, the smoked Gouda, and the ghost pepper jack. And they were all really creamy, even it's called the uncreamery, but these were very creamy cheeses, and they had a really nice texture. I was very excited to try them, so you might check that out. And then speaking of cheese, it's really exciting how far we've come, because so many people who say that they can't go vegan or can't reduce eating animals is because of the cheese. And now we've got so many wonderful entrepreneurs who are creating great products. One of my favorite shops in New York is Riverdale, and they have a great cheese shop, a vegan cheese shop in Brooklyn, and now they're opening another one in Manhattan called the Essex Market Kitchen on Essex Street, and they're having a wine and cheese tasting. Isn't that fun? On October 10th. So if you're in New York, you might want to look for that, Riverdale's wine and cheese tasting at the Essex Market. Oh, so I have just 1 minute, 2 minutes left, 2 minutes left. There's so much going on in the world related to food. And what can we do about it? We can do a lot. And that's what this book, We Are the Weather, is all about. And we're all a part of it. We're all a part of making a very positive difference. And I was happy to hear that eating healthfully is not expensive, or doesn't have to be expensive, and can actually help save money. I can't help but think about legumes, for example. Legumes are just such a wonderful food, and how inexpensive they are. So there's a lot of arguments that we hear from other people, and some of them we hear in our own head. And if you read the book We Are the Weather and you go to the part that's called Dispute with the Soul, you read the voices, the arguments, the struggles that we all have within ourselves to keep us from doing what's best for ourselves, what'll make us happiest. But we can all do so much. And I also wanted to get back, I mentioned my Rosh Hashanah recipes. At Responsible Eating and Living, my motivation for being vegan was not to harm animals. And there are lots of reasons to eat plants and not animals. Certainly, we need it for the climate and for the environment and for reducing chronic diseases. There are so many reasons. But our recipes, number one, are free of animals. And we have all kinds. Some of them are quite decadent. And then others focus on nourishing you deliciously if you're in a health crisis, or if you just want to get healthier or feel better. It's all there. And we are there to support whatever it is you're looking for. But the bottom line is we need to eat less animals, or no animals at all. And we can help you do that at responsibleeatingandliving.com. And for those of you who are celebrating the Jewish New Year, we have some wonderful Rosh Hashanah recipes, and I hope you'll check them out. Well, this has been a fun show. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. You can reach me at info@realmeals.org. And in the meantime, have a very delicious week.